There's a hidden chapter of history where ink and gold held more power than swords, where artists and scholars became guardians of forbidden knowledge. Picture this: dimly lit workshops tucked away in the shadows of medieval cities, where skilled hands transformed parchment into masterpieces, embedding secrets into every stroke of color and glint of gold. These weren't just books or decorations, they were vessels of ideas so dangerous, their creators risked everything to bring them to life. Welcome to the underground world of ink, gold, and secrets, where art became rebellion and beauty disguised defiance. Why would something as delicate as an illuminated manuscript threaten kings and empires? Because within these pages lay ideas that could shake the foundations of power philosophies deemed heretical, scientific discoveries labeled as sorcery, and truths too radical for their time. The artists and scribes who crafted these works weren't just artisans, they were part of a secret network, passing knowledge like whispers in the dark. Their tools, brushes dipped in precious pigments, gold leaf that caught the light like a coded signal, and symbols hidden in plain sight. Every flourish of the pen was an act of courage, every illuminated letter a silent protest. But this story isn't just about the past. It's about the enduring power of creativity to outlast oppression. Think about the alchemists who turned lead into gold, both literally and metaphorically, or the monks who smuggled forbidden texts beneath the robes of their faith. These weren't just rebels, they were preservationists, ensuring that knowledge survived against all odds. And now, centuries later, we're able to piece together their hidden legacy. So let's step into their world, where every stroke of ink and glimmer of gold tells a story of resistance, ingenuity, and the unbreakable human spirit. The journey begins now. The medieval world was a place of strict hierarchies and rigid beliefs, where questioning authority often came with dire consequences. Yet, even under the watchful eyes of kings and clerics, ideas deemed too dangerous to share found their way into the hands of those bold enough to preserve them. Imagine a scholar carefully copying an ancient text in a secluded monastery, knowing full well that its contents could get him branded a heretic, or an artist weaving forbidden symbols into the borders of a sacred manuscript, trusting that only the initiated would recognize their meaning. These were acts of quiet defiance, a testament to the unyielding human thirst for knowledge. What made certain texts so threatening? Some contained scientific theories that contradicted religious doctrine, like the idea that the earth revolved around the sun rather than the other way around. Others preserved pagan philosophies or medical knowledge that challenged the teachings of the church. Even historical accounts that painted rulers in an unflattering light were often suppressed. But the real danger wasn't just in the ideas themselves, it was in who might access them. Knowledge was power, and in the wrong hands it could inspire rebellion, reform, or revolution. This underground network of scribes and illuminators didn't just preserve texts, they transformed them. A book of astronomy might be disguised as a harmless treatise on agriculture, its true meaning hidden in coded language or intricate illustrations. A seemingly innocent prayer book could contain marginal notes detailing forbidden alchemical experiments. The most skilled among them mastered the art of steganography, embedding messages so subtly that only those who knew where to look could decipher them. And while many of these works were eventually destroyed, others survived, buried in secret libraries or passed hand to hand like contraband. The risks were immense. Discovery could mean imprisonment, torture, or worse. Yet, the scribes and artists who undertook this dangerous work understood something profound, that ideas once unleashed cannot be easily erased. Even if their names were forgotten, their words and images endured, whispering across centuries to those willing to listen. Today, when we examine these surviving manuscripts, we're not just seeing ink and gold, we're witnessing the quiet courage of those who refused to let truth be extinguished. The vibrant hues of medieval manuscripts weren't just for show, they were the product of meticulous, almost magical craftsmanship. Behind every stroke of crimson, azure, or emerald lay a carefully concocted ink, brewed from ingredients that read like an alchemist's shopping list. Lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan, ground into ultramarine blue so costly it was reserved for the robes of the Virgin Mary. Vermilion, a brilliant red made from toxic mercury sulfide, handled with reverence and caution. Even humble oak galls, those knobby growths on tree bark, were transformed into iron gall ink, the workhorse of scribes, yet capable of eating through parchment if mixed improperly. These weren't mere pigments, they were alchemical triumphs, each carrying its own lore and power. But why go to such lengths? Because ink itself was a language. A manuscript written in gold or rare colors signaled wealth and divine favor, but it could also serve as camouflage. Certain inks reacted uniquely to heat, revealing hidden text when warmed by candlelight. Others faded over time, leaving behind only what the creator intended to endure. The most ingenious inks were designed to resist erasure, making it nearly impossible for authorities to scrub away forbidden words without destroying the entire page. This was chemistry as subterfuge, where every vial held the potential for deception or defiance. The guardians of these recipes weren't just artisans, they were keepers of secrets. Ink-making guilds operated like medieval spy networks, swearing initiates to oaths of silence. A master might teach his apprentice to prepare a basic black ink, but withhold the formula for an invisible variant until trust was earned. Some recipes were encrypted, written in riddles or buried within herbals and medical texts to avoid suspicion. And when political tensions flared, certain inks vanished altogether, their ingredients too dangerous to possess. A scribe caught with a batch of heretics crimson could face accusations of witchcraft, for who but a conspirator would need ink that refused to fade under scrutiny? The legacy of these inks lingers in the pages that survive. Modern conservators marvel at their resilience, how after centuries, some hues remain as vivid as the day they were painted. But more haunting are the traces of what's been lost. Faint stains where forbidden words were scraped away, or patches of parchment worn thin from constant handling by desperate readers. These quiet marks tell another story, one of fragility and persistence, because while empires could burn libraries and ban ideas, they couldn't erase every glimmer of gold or whisper of indigo. The inks, like the truths they carried, found a way to endure. Gold leaf in medieval manuscripts was more than mere decoration. It was a bridge between the earthly and the divine. When an illuminator carefully applied those paper-thin sheets of beaten gold, they weren't just adding luxury, they were channeling something transcendent. In a world lit by candlelight, gold didn't just reflect flames. It seemed to emit its own celestial glow, mimicking the radiance of heaven itself. The Church sanctioned this use, of course, to depict halos and sacred scenes. But beneath that sanctioned symbolism lay another layer of meaning, one understood only by those trained to see it. Certain manuscripts, particularly those containing esoteric knowledge, were distinguished by their gold work. Guilds of illuminators developed secret techniques, tiny pinpricks in the gold to form constellations, or patterns so subtle they only revealed themselves when the page was tilted toward the light. A circle of gold might represent the sun to most viewers, but to an initiate, it could mark a hidden alchemical formula or a map to a forbidden library. The very presence of elaborate gold leaf often signaled that a book carried deeper secrets, camouflaged in sacred splendor. The process of applying gold was itself a ritual. Before laying the fragile leaves, illuminators would paint the parchment with a sticky mixture called mordant, often infused with sacred resins or even ground gemstones. Then, using a brush made of fine squirrel hair, they'd lift each delicate sheet, breathing carefully to avoid disturbing it. A single misstep could ruin hours of work. But when done perfectly, the gold adhered like captured sunlight, its surface burnished to a mirror-like shine with a polished agate or even a wolf's tooth, tools believed to impart spiritual purity to the metal. What's fascinating is how gold's duality mirrored the manuscript's purpose. To the untrained eye, it was simply beautiful. To the knowledgeable, it was a beacon. A shimmering border might frame a psalm, but hidden in its curves could be astrological diagrams or coded messages about herbal remedies banned by the church. Even the way gold interacted with light held meaning. Some designs only became visible when a manuscript was viewed at dawn or dusk, aligning with ancient solstice traditions. This wasn't just artistry, it was a sophisticated language of survival, ensuring dangerous knowledge could be shared under the guise of piety. Today, conservators use advanced imaging to uncover these hidden layers, revealing how gold leaf often concealed as much as it illuminated. Some manuscripts show traces of underlying sketches, entire passages painted over with gold, effectively erasing them from casual view. Others bear faint indentations where symbols were pressed into the metal, invisible until light grazes them at just the right angle. These discoveries remind us that in the hands of medieval illuminators, gold wasn't just a medium, it was a shield, a cipher, and sometimes a whispered rebellion. Behind the unassuming walls of merchant homes, tucked beneath floorboards in remote castles, and even concealed within hollowed-out trees, a parallel literary world thrived in medieval Europe, one that church and crown never fully controlled. These were the secret libraries, private collections painstakingly assembled by scholars, noble patrons, and even rogue clerics who believed knowledge shouldn't be confined by dogma. Unlike the grand scriptoria of monasteries, these archives operated in whispers, their existence known only to an inner circle of trusted minds. Take the case of Federico da Montefeltro, a 15th-century duke whose lavish public library in Urbino dazzled visitors with its sanctioned texts, while his true treasures lay elsewhere. Behind a disguised door in his palace, accessible only by solving a mechanical puzzle, stood shelves of manuscripts that would have sent shockwaves through the church. Astronomy treatises arguing for a sun-centered universe, Arabic medical texts challenging Galen's theories, even works of Neoplatonic magic, all meticulously organized under false titles in his catalogue. His librarians developed an ingenious system. Colored thread woven into the spines indicated a book's true subject, while dummy labels proclaimed pious contents. A volume marked Lives of Saints in gold lettering might contain Avicenna's radical anatomy studies, its real identity apparent only to those who knew to check the crimson silk peeking from the binding. The logistics of these hidden collections reveal astonishing ingenuity. Some owners built double libraries, an outer room of acceptable texts for casual inspection, with the forbidden works concealed behind sliding panels or beneath rotating bookcases. The Medici family allegedly stored their most controversial acquisitions inside hollowed-out choir benches at their private chapel, retrieving them during musical performances when the singing masked the sound of moving panels. Others employed the medieval equivalent of encryption. A bookseller in Padua was renowned for his mirror catalogues, where every third entry was fictitious, making it impossible for authorities to reconstruct a library's true holdings from seized records. What made these secret troves so dangerous wasn't just their content, it was their accessibility. Unlike monastery libraries chained to lecterns, these books circulated among networks of thinkers. A physician in Paris might receive a coded request for a specific chapter, which would then be copied onto seemingly innocent parchment strips and smuggled inside rolled-up maps or musical instruments. Some collectors developed elaborate lending protocols, like the Venetian who required borrowers to leave a hostage, usually a valuable but orthodox book, as collateral, ensuring both discretion and the work's eventual return. The fragility of this system was its greatest vulnerability. When the Inquisition raided a suspected library in Toulouse in 1285, they discovered not just banned texts, but a meticulous lending ledger that unraveled an entire web of readers across southern France. Yet for every collection lost to fire or confiscation, others survived through sheer cunning. In Montpellier, a medical school professor reportedly walled up his library inside a chimney during a crackdown, leaving only a single loose brick marked with an alchemical symbol as a clue for future generations. Centuries later, renovators found the cache intact, the books wrapped in waxed cloth, their margins still bearing notes from long-dead students who'd risked everything to learn. These hidden archives did more than preserve texts. They sustained conversations across generations. Marginal notes in surviving copies show readers centuries apart engaging with each other's ideas. A 13th century skeptic's objection answered by a 15th century humanist's discovery, their dialogue spanning the very persecutions meant to silence them. The secret libraries weren't just storehouses of knowledge. They were living arguments against oblivion, proof that ideas could outlast even the most determined silence. A rabbit nibbling a stalk of wheat might seem like a charming detail in a medieval manuscript until you learn it was code for a forbidden fertility ritual. In the hands of illuminators, every creature, color, and curl of foliage could carry dual meanings, creating a visual language that danced on the edge of heresy. Take the humble snail, often painted crawling along manuscript margins. To most viewers, it symbolized the slow passage of time or the resurrection. But in certain circles, its spiral shell secretly represented the alchemical process of distillation, while its trail mimicked the cryptic symbols used to denote underground smuggling routes. These weren't whimsical doodles, they were carefully constructed signs, designed to bypass censors while whispering truths to initiates. Some of the most daring symbolism hid in plain sight within religious scenes themselves. A saint holding an unusual tool like a pair of compasses or an apothecary's scales might actually be honoring a banned scientist or philosopher. The famous 14th century Smithfield decretals depict Saint Augustine with an armillary sphere, a complex astronomical instrument. Officially, it celebrated his wisdom, but those familiar with the ongoing debates about cosmology recognized it as a quiet endorsement of celestial theories the Church had condemned. Even floral borders held secrets. Certain arrangements of lilies and roses corresponded to mnemonic devices for remembering herbal remedies that challenged Gaelic medicine. Geometry became another powerful cipher. Interlocking knots in Celtic manuscripts weren't just decorative. Their precise mathematical ratios often encoded navigational star charts or architectural secrets from suppressed guild traditions. In one stunning example from an Austrian monastery, a seemingly random pattern of dots in a stained glass window illustration actually plotted the positions of comets visible only in the Middle East, knowledge that could have come solely from Arabic astronomers whose works were banned in Europe. The Illuminator had turned a biblical scene into an astronomical time capsule, preserving data that contradicted approved Christian cosmology. Perhaps the most ingenious codes involved color alchemy. A dragon painted in specific shades of green and gold, might represent an alchemical formula for vitriol, while a rainbow-hued bird could symbolize the steps of the philosopher's stone process. These chromatic puzzles were especially effective because color symbolism varied by region. What appeared orthodox in Paris might scream heresy in Toledo, allowing ideas to travel safely across borders. Modern multispectral imaging has revealed even deeper layers. Some manuscripts show traces of pigments that would have changed color when exposed to heat or sunlight, creating disappearing messages for those who knew how to activate them. The true brilliance of this system lay in its deniability. If confronted, an artist could always claim a snail was just a snail, or that gold leaf patterns were merely decorative. Only when certain symbols appeared together, a fox near a particular constellation, a uniquely shaped tower in the distance, did their full meaning emerge. Like a medieval version of steganography, the most dangerous ideas were scattered across pages and even across volumes, requiring collectors to assemble the pieces like an intellectual jigsaw puzzle. This fragmentation protected both the creators and the knowledge itself. Even if one manuscript was destroyed, fragments of its message survived elsewhere. Today, digital reconstruction allows us to see these connections as never before. By virtually stacking pages from different manuscripts, researchers have uncovered sprawling symbolic networks, a dragon's tail in one book completing a celestial map started in another, or a series of initials that form an acrostic when read across multiple psalters. What once seemed like isolated anomalies now reveal themselves as threads in a vast, invisible tapestry of resistance. The Illuminators' greatest trick wasn't just hiding messages in images, it was making sure those messages could only be found by those truly prepared to receive them. Monasteries, with their vows of obedience and devotion, were the last places anyone would expect to find rebellion, yet within their scriptoria, a quiet revolution unfolded. These copying rooms, where monks meticulously reproduced sacred texts by candlelight, became unlikely sanctuaries for ideas the church sought to erase. While most scribes dutifully transcribed approved scriptures, a daring few saw their quills as tools of preservation, smuggling forbidden knowledge between the lines of psalters and prayer books. Imagine a monk hunched over his parchment, carefully inserting Aristotle's banned logic into a commentary on Genesis, or disguising an Arabic medical treatise as an innocent herbal remedy guide. Every stroke of the pen was a calculated risk, a silent act of defiance wrapped in the cloak of piety. The system relied on clever deception. A monk might copy an approved text in large, clear script for inspection, while reserving the margins and blank spaces for condensed versions of prohibited works, written in tiny, nearly invisible lettering. Some developed palimpsests, scraping away old parchment to reuse it, but leaving just enough of the original text to be reconstructed by those who knew how to look. Others employed symbolic abbreviations, a cluster of odd-looking initials that, when decoded, revealed references to pagan philosophers or heretical scientists. The most audacious scribes even altered existing texts during copying, subtly correcting errors in church-approved astronomy or quietly removing passages condemning certain scholars. What drove these men to such dangerous work? For some, it was personal conviction, a belief that truth transcended institutional authority. Others were part of intellectual networks stretching from Spain to Constantinople, where preserving knowledge was seen as sacred duty. A fascinating case comes from the monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy, where 11th century monks secretly copied Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, a Roman Epicurean text denying divine intervention in nature. They disguised it as part of a biblical commentary, adding pious headings that fooled censors for centuries. When rediscovered during the Renaissance, this single surviving copy became foundational to modern scientific thought, a proof that one monk's courage could alter history. The scriptorium's very structure aided their subterfuge. The tedious, repetitive nature of copying meant overseers rarely scrutinized every page. A senior monk might approve a work's beginning and end, leaving the middle vulnerable to interpolation. The noise of quills scratching and pages turning provided cover for whispered discussions about controversial texts. Even the monastic schedule helped. Late-night copying sessions allowed small groups to work undisturbed, their oil lamps burning long after compline prayers. But the risks were severe. In 1229, an entire Benedictine scriptorium in France was disbanded after an inquisitor found marginal notes questioning transubstantiation. The offending pages were burned, the scribes sent to remote penitentiaries. Yet remarkably, some of their work survived. A few sheets smuggled out in a visiting bishop's luggage later resurfaced in a Swiss monastery, where the dangerous annotations were recopied with even greater care. This cat-and-mouse game played out across Europe, with each generation of scribes developing more sophisticated methods to outwit censors. The legacy of these clandestine copyists lives on in unexpected ways. Modern scholars using ultraviolet light have uncovered erased texts beneath medieval manuscripts, entire works preserved because monks scraped parchment clean rather than destroy it. Some monastic libraries still hold mixed volumes where orthodox and forbidden texts coexist, their contradictions smoothed over by careful editing. Perhaps most telling are the personal notes occasionally found in margins, a scribe's quiet plea for future readers to judge for yourself, or an anxious sketch of an owl symbolizing wisdom hidden in a decorative initial. These small acts of defiance remind us that even in the most controlled environments, the human hunger for knowledge cannot be extinguished, only driven underground where it waits patiently for the light. Behind every daring medieval artist who pushed boundaries stood an equally bold patron, wealthy nobles, merchants, and even clergy who quietly funded works that defied the intellectual status quo. These weren't just passive supporters, they were active collaborators in a dangerous game of cultural subversion. Take the case of Duke Federico of Urbino, who commissioned a seemingly orthodox prayer book with one crucial twist. Hidden within its lavish illuminations were precise astronomical diagrams contradicting church-approved cosmology. His court artist, a man skilled in both brushwork and discretion, embedded these heresies so subtly that the book sat openly in the ducal chapel for decades before scholars detected its secrets. The relationship between heretical artists and their patrons operated like a medieval version of intellectual venture capitalism. A wealthy merchant in Bruges might fund an altarpiece depicting saints with one hand while using the other to commission clandestine alchemical manuscripts from the same workshop. These patrons didn't just provide gold, they offered protection networks, smuggling routes for banned reference materials, and safe houses when authorities grew suspicious. In return, they gained access to knowledge even kings couldn't buy openly: treatises on experimental medicine, translations of Arabic mathematics, or star charts more accurate than those sanctioned by Rome. Some of the most fascinating partnerships blurred the line between patron and co-conspirator. Isabella d'Este, the famed Renaissance collector, didn't merely acquire controversial works, she participated in their creation. Letters reveal her instructing artists on how to disguise hermetic symbolism within classical motifs, once advising a painter to let the serpent's coils mirror the lunar nodes, but only for eyes that know to count. Her private studiolo became a sanctuary for thinkers who'd been expelled from universities, its walls covered in frescoes that mapped forbidden cosmological theories onto mythological scenes. The risks were brutally real. when the Florentine banker Giovanni Russilli was discovered funding a translation of Lucretius's atheistic poetry in 1484, his family faced excommunication and financial ruin. Yet the rewards outweighed the dangers. For many, these patrons weren't just preserving knowledge, they were shaping the future. A single manuscript commissioned by the Hungarian nobleman János Vitéz contained Copernican astronomical theories decades before they became mainstream, its calculations hidden in the geometric patterns of a saint's robe. Without these financial backers, entire schools of thought might have vanished forever. What's often overlooked is how these relationships transformed art itself. The need for plausible deniability led to astonishing creative leaps: alchemical symbols disguised as decorative flourishes, heliocentric solar systems depicted as halos around Christ's head. One particularly audacious painter working for the Visconti family developed a technique using temperature-sensitive pigments. His portraits of saints appeared conventional until warmed by a candle, revealing layers of anatomical sketches beneath. This wasn't just coding information, it was pioneering new artistic technologies under the pressure of persecution. The legacy of these alliances lingers in museums today, where seemingly straightforward religious works contain puzzles we're only now deciphering. Infrared scans of a 15th century triptych in Ghent revealed underdrawings of experimental machinery, likely funded by a cloth merchant investing in automation. A book of hours in Vienna's collection shows zodiac signs rotating accurately around a central sun, a detail that escaped notice for centuries because the artist buried it in a crowded border of vines and birds. These works remind us that cultural revolutions aren't always loud. Sometimes they're whispered in gold leaf and lapis lazuli, paid for by patrons courageous enough to bet on ideas the world wasn't ready to see. The trade of forbidden manuscripts moved through medieval Europe like smoke, present everywhere but impossible to grasp. In the cobblestone alleys behind Parisian universities, dealers conducted business with their faces half hidden by hoods, their precious cargo wrapped in plain cloth to resemble ordinary goods. A merchant might sell bolts of wool by day, but after dark, his cellar became a showroom for texts that could land both buyer and seller in prison. The most sought-after works weren't just hidden, they were disguised. A volume of Aristotle's forbidden works on natural philosophy might be bound inside the covers of a saint's biography, its true contents revealed only by a nearly invisible ink mark on the spine. Authentication required elaborate rituals. Buyers would examine a manuscript's quire numbers, the small markings on folded parchment sheets, checking for sequences that matched secret catalogs circulated among trusted collectors. Some dealers embedded threads of colored silk between pages, weaving patterns that verified a text's origins. The most sophisticated systems used watermarks pressed into the paper during manufacturing, visible only when held to light at a precise angle. A Florentine bookseller named Vespasiano Dobistix reportedly developed an ingenious method. He would tear a single page from an original manuscript and give half to the buyer as a key. Only when the fragments matched perfectly upon delivery would the full payment change hands. The logistics of this trade reveal remarkable ingenuity. Manuscripts traveled in false-bottomed wine barrels, sewn into the linings of pilgrims' cloaks, or even baked inside loaves of bread. In Venice, where the maritime trade offered cover, banned books arrived crated alongside spices, their pungent aromas deterring inspectors from digging too deep. Some dealers employed a relay system. A book would change hands multiple times across different cities, with no single courier knowing both origin and destination. The Medici family's network used blind drops in churches, leaving packages beneath specific pews during crowded masses where observers wouldn't notice the exchange. Demand created specialized roles in this shadow economy. text surgeons could dismantle and rebind a manuscript in hours, altering its appearance entirely. Scribes known as echo writers produced flawless replicas with tiny intentional errors, a misspelled word on page 47, an extra serif on a single letter, creating fingerprints to distinguish copies from forgeries. Underground librarians maintained encrypted catalogs, using musical notation or chess notation to mask titles and authors. Even the paper itself became a clue. Connoisseurs could identify a banned work's origin by the unique texture of parchment made from Spanish goatskin versus Italian calfskin. The consequences of discovery were severe. In 1433, a book dealer in Cologne was executed after authorities found Arabic medical texts hidden in his shop's rafters. But the trade persisted because the incentives were enormous. A single rare manuscript could fetch the equivalent of a nobleman's yearly income, with prices soaring for works by controversial figures like Averroes or Roger Bacon. Some collectors willingly bankrupted themselves to possess forbidden knowledge, while others saw it as investment, hoarding texts they knew would grow more valuable as church crackdowns intensified. What's often overlooked is how this black market preserved knowledge that shaped the modern world. A surviving ledger from a Siena bookseller lists transactions that smuggled Vitruvius's writings on architecture into the hands of Renaissance builders, enabling engineering breakthroughs. Another records the sale of a disguised copy of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things to a young scholar, likely influencing his later work challenging church doctrine. These weren't just commercial exchanges, they were quiet acts of cultural transmission, ensuring that even the most dangerous ideas could slip through the cracks of censorship and ignite revolutions centuries later. The legacy of this underground network lingers in the way we handle controversial information today. Modern rare book dealers still use techniques descended from medieval practices, watermarks, chemical tests, and provenance trails that would feel familiar to a 15th century bibliophile. And when conservators examine these surviving manuscripts, they sometimes find faint fingerprints in the margins, evidence of readers who risked everything to turn the page. Hidden in the margins of medieval manuscripts, a parallel universe of thought unfolds where scribes and artists left traces of their unspoken rebellions and private musings. These weren't just idle doodles or absent-minded scribbles, they were carefully placed breadcrumbs of dissent, humor, and forbidden knowledge. Take the famous Lincoln Cathedral Psalter, where a monk sketched a rabbit brandishing a sword, triumphantly standing over a defeated hunting dog. At first glance, it's a whimsical scene, but scholars now recognize it as a coded critique of feudal oppression, a powerless creature turning the tables on its predator. The margins became a canvas for subversion, where artists could say what the main text dared not. Some Marginalia served as intellectual Easter eggs. In a 12th century copy of Priscian's Latin grammar, now housed in Oxford's Bodleian Library, a scribe filled the borders with intricate knotwork that, when followed with a finger, reveals geometric proofs contradicting church-approved mathematics. Another manuscript from Chartres hides musical notation in the tendrils of vine decorations, a melody that, when played, encodes the ratios for an experimental astrolabe. These weren't mere decorations, they were clandestine teaching tools, preserving knowledge that couldn't be shared openly. The humor in Marginalia often carried sharp edges. A bishop's personal prayer book might feature grotesque caricatures of local nobility tucked among the prayers, their exaggerated features mocking the powerful under the guise of harmless fantasy. One particularly bold artist in a French monastery drew a fox preaching to geese in the margin of a biblical text, a thinly veiled jab at corrupt clergy. These visual jokes relied on plausible deniability. If challenged, the creator could always claim it was just a silly doodle. but the intended audience understood the satire, laughing quietly at truths too dangerous to speak aloud. Alchemical manuscripts took marginal coding to astonishing levels. A recipe for invisible ink in a 15th century German text appears as random blots until you realize the stains form constellations when held to candlelight, pinpointing the optimal lunar phase for the ink's preparation. Other alchemists used marginal sketches of distillation equipment with subtle alterations, an extra coil in a serpent's tail indicating a longer heating process, or a bird's outstretched wings signaling the precise angle for a condenser. These visual shortcuts allowed masters to pass on trade secrets without committing them to plain text. Perhaps the most poignant marginalia are the personal notes, those fleeting moments when a scribe's hand slipped from devotion to despair or wonder. In a copy of Augustine's City of God, a weary monk wrote in faint ink, "The candle fails, my fingers ache, but still the abbot demands more pages." Another left a bitter couplet about winter cold seeping into the scriptorium, his letters growing jagged as if shivering on the parchment. These unguarded glimpses remind us that behind every perfect Latin phrase were human hands, human frustrations, and sometimes human defiance. Modern technology has unveiled even deeper layers. Multispectral imaging on a seemingly bland herbal manuscript revealed erased marginal notes detailing contraceptive recipes, knowledge so controversial the scribe had scraped it away, but not thoroughly enough to evade 21st century light analysis. Another manuscript, when exposed to ultraviolet, showed a constellation map hidden beneath innocent floral doodles. Its stars aligned to a comet sighting that church authorities had dismissed as an evil omen. The margins, it seems, were where truth went to whisper when the main text was forced to shout orthodox lies. What makes these marginal marks so extraordinary is their duality. They existed in the interstices, neither fully public nor entirely private. A doodle could be passed off as decoration if discovered, yet carry explosive meaning for those in the know. In an era when direct dissent meant prison or worse, the margins became a sanctuary for free thought, a place where quills could dance just beyond the reach of censors' blades. And now, centuries later, we're finally learning to read between their lines. In the dim candlelight of a convent scriptorium, a nun's steady hand traces gold leaf onto parchment, her name forever absent from the finished work. This was the reality for countless women who shaped medieval intellectual life while remaining shadow figures in official records. Though guild rolls and university rosters overwhelmingly list men, the evidence whispers another story of women who mastered the secret arts, not in spite of their gender, but often because of the unique spaces they occupied beyond institutional scrutiny. Convents became unexpected hubs of forbidden knowledge. While male scribes faced strict oversight, noble women cloistered in abbeys like Quedlinburg or Los Hulgas enjoyed relative freedom to collect and copy controversial texts. The 12th century Abbess Herad of Hohenberg compiled an encyclopedia containing Arabic astronomy and Greek philosophy, cleverly framing it as devotional study. In Spain, Jewish and Muslim women preserved medical knowledge banned by the church, disguising herbal remedies as household recipes passed mother to daughter. These weren't mere copyists, they were curators of entire traditions, using piety as both shield and conduit. Outside religious walls, women operated in even more daring ways. The alchemical manuscripts of Maria the Jewess, a legendary figure whose recipes influenced centuries of chemistry, contain clues suggesting she was actually a network of women working under a single pseudonym. In Venice, court records reveal female glassmakers secretly experimenting with lenses and prisms, their findings smuggled into optics treatises under male colleagues' names. Even the infamous witches' grimoires often proved to be coded notebooks of female healers, their lunar calendars and plant diagrams later misinterpreted as occultism. Patronage offered another avenue for influence. Marguerite of Navarre, sister to a French king, funded translations of suppressed mystical texts while her male relatives hunted heretics. Her salon became a haven for radical thinkers, where dangerous ideas circulated under the guise of courtly poetry. More subtly, merchant-class women like Alessandra Strozzi of Florence commissioned devotional artworks packed with subversive symbolism, a Madonna's blue robe containing lapis lazuli ground to exact alchemical specifications, or a Christ child's halo mirroring celestial maps. The erasure of these contributions wasn't accidental. When the church burned the library of Heloise, Abelard's brilliant partner, they specifically targeted her annotations on classical logic. Inquisition records from Languedoc show female scribes being punished more harshly than men for identical offenses, their tools, quills, ink pots, even reading glasses branded as instruments of heresy. Yet traces persist. A 13th-century Psalter in Krakow contains faint underdrawings of human anatomy, too precise to come from Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter alone, likely guided by a midwife's hands-on experience. A Catalan herbal manuscript features plant illustrations matching oral traditions from local wise women, their knowledge preserved in pigment despite being excluded from official medical schools. What makes their legacy extraordinary is how they turned marginalization into advantage. Denied access to universities, women developed alternative networks through embroidery patterns that encoded mathematical sequences or laundry marks that doubled as alchemical symbols. Excluded from guilds, they perfected domestic arts like textile dyeing that quietly advanced chemistry. Even the humble act of teaching children became a vehicle for preservation. Lullabies in Occitan and Breton contained mnemonics for banned astronomical concepts, ensuring generations would carry the knowledge forward. Modern technology is finally revealing their full impact. Spectral imaging of the Ripoll Bible uncovered layers of female handwriting beneath male scribes' final touches. Chemical analysis shows certain purple inks used in English manuscripts match recipes unique to nunneries. And in Austria, a stash of household notes, long dismissed as shopping lists, proved to contain encrypted alchemical formulas. Their author identified through pollen traces linking the paper to a noblewoman's sealed garden. These discoveries don't just add missing names to history, they rewrite our understanding of how knowledge survived, proving that sometimes the most effective rebellion wore a wimple, a merchant's hood, or a healer's apron. The crackling flames of a medieval book burning sent more than smoke into the air. They cast long shadows of fear and fascination across entire cities. When authorities piled manuscripts onto pyres in town squares, they weren't merely destroying parchment, they were staging a brutal performance of power, a warning carved into public memory. Yet these spectacles often backfired spectacularly. Take the infamous Paris burnings of 1244, where wagon loads of Jewish Talmudic texts were torched under orders from Pope Innocent IV. The church hoped to erase rabbinical scholarship, but the event became a recruitment tool for clandestine copyists. Within weeks, scribes as far as Toledo and Mainz were racing to duplicate the condemned works, hiding them in cellars and even burying them in sealed jars, a literary underground springing to life where suppression struck hardest. What made certain texts worth burning? The answer reveals medieval power structures laid bare. Astronomy books challenging Earth's place at the universe's center were frequent targets, their ashes mingling with those of medical texts disputing Galen's anatomy. But the rarest flames were reserved for works of political prophecy like the Oracles of Leo the Wise, a Byzantine text predicting the fall of empires, which Venetian officials burned in 1428, only to find handwritten copies circulating within months, each bearing minor errors that actually updated its predictions. The more furiously authorities tried to erase ideas, the more valuable they became, transforming forbidden manuscripts into intellectual currency traded at premium prices. The logistics of these purges show how haphazard censorship could be. Inquisitors often lacked the expertise to identify banned content, leading to darkly comic errors. A 14th century raid on a Bolognese bookseller's stock accidentally incinerated 200 innocuous prayer books, while missing a chest of genuinely heretical works disguised as agricultural manuals. Some officials became so obsessed with hunting dangerous imagery that they burned perfectly orthodox texts like the Bishop of Trier, who destroyed an entire library after mistaking architectural diagrams for necromantic symbols. These blunders fueled a thriving industry of forgers who produced fake, forbidden manuscripts to sell to paranoid collectors, complete with fabricated marginal notes from famous heretics. Witness accounts reveal the psychological impact of these burnings. A Florentine diarist describes watching a rare Arabic geometry text tossed onto the flames, its gilded diagrams curling into smoke as a nearby student quietly recited its theorems from memory. In Prague, a bookseller forced to burn his own inventory was seen pocketing fragments of half-charred pages fragments later found sewn into his daughter's wedding gown as a hidden dowry of knowledge. These weren't just acts of destruction, they were dramatic unveilings showing ordinary citizens exactly which ideas terrified the powerful enough to turn them to ash. The greatest irony lies in what survived. Fire-resistant materials like vellum often emerged from pyres merely scorched, their contents still legible. Some quick-thinking scholars tossed damp logs onto bonfires, creating smoke clouds that let them snatch books from the edges. In one remarkable case from Rouen, a group of medical students used the chaos of a burning to steal back an anatomical text, its pages slightly singed but still usable, the fire having cauterized the very wounds it was meant to inflict. Even the ashes told stories. Analyzers of book-burning sites in modern Erfurt discovered flecks of gold and lapis lazuli in the soil, revealing which illuminated manuscripts had been deemed most threatening by their pigments alone. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of these burnings was the unintended spotlight they cast. Each pyre became a perverse advertisement, signaling to curious minds exactly where the boundaries of thought lay and how to cross them. When the Bishop of Wurzburg burned a collection of vernacular Bibles in 1498, he unwittingly inspired a surge in secret translations. The very acts meant to erase ideas often etched them deeper into cultural memory, like invisible ink revealed by history's flame. What authorities failed to grasp was this: you can burn a book, but you can't burn the curiosity that turns smoke into a signal. A single scrap of parchment stitched into a prayer book's binding might seem insignificant until ultraviolet light reveals it's a surviving fragment of Averroes-banned commentary on Aristotle, deliberately hidden there by a terrified scribe. These orphan pages, these ghosts of erased ideas, are the ultimate testaments to censorship's imperfect power. Across Europe's libraries, scholars are now playing detective with multispectral cameras and X-ray fluorescence scanners, turning what were once considered damaged or worthless manuscripts into the most exciting archaeological digs of the intellect. Take the Archimedes palimpsest, a humble Byzantine prayer book that spent centuries in plain sight before modern imaging exposed its shocking secret. Beneath the hymns, the original text had been scraped away to reuse the parchment, but not thoroughly enough to erase Archimedes' groundbreaking mathematical theorems. What makes this discovery chilling is the context. The original writings were likely erased during the 13th century purge of Greek science, when church authorities ordered pagan knowledge recycled into Christian texts. Yet the very act meant to destroy Archimedes' work inadvertently preserved it. The overwritten prayers protected the fragile ink beneath from light and air damage that would have destroyed a standalone manuscript. Irony couldn't be sharper. The censorship intended to silence ancient wisdom became its unexpected savior. Other fragments survived through even more ingenious methods. In Vienna's National Library, a mundane-looking book of hours contains 6 seemingly blank pages at the back, until you shine infrared light on them, revealing they're actually pages from an outlawed Cathar religious text, carefully washed clean and re-stretched to appear innocuous. The scribe had left one tiny clue, a nearly invisible drop of red ink in the corner, likely a secret marker for trusted readers to know where to look. Similarly, a cathedral inventory in York lists a worm-damaged psalter that, upon recent inspection, proved to have selective wormholes. Someone had deliberately exposed only certain pages to insects, creating natural-looking damage that obscured controversial passages while leaving the rest intact. The detective work required to reconstruct these fragments is staggering. At Oxford's Bodleian Library, researchers spent 3 years digitally reassembling a single page from a shredded 14th-century herbal. The original had been torn into strips by Inquisition officials, but a quick-thinking apothecary had gathered the pieces and used them as binding tape for his account ledger. Using algorithmic pattern recognition, scholars matched the torn edges and ink splatters like a jigsaw puzzle, revealing a forbidden chapter on contraceptive herbs that contradicted church doctrine on marriage. Even more remarkably, the ledger itself contained coded sales records showing who had accessed this knowledge: midwives and married women from every social class, their names hidden in plain sight as mundane transactions of rosemary and lavender. What emerges from these fragments isn't just lost knowledge, it's a map of resistance. A charred corner of parchment from an auto-da-fe in Toledo was found sewn into a quilt, its partial astrological chart still bearing finger smudges from desperate attempts to memorize it before burning. A single surviving leaf from a condemned translation of the Quran in Sicily shows meticulous corrections in the margin, evidence that despite the ban, someone was still collating different versions to improve accuracy. Even the glue used in bookbindings tells stories. Chemical analysis of a French missal revealed it contained dissolved fragments of a Jewish mystical text, likely mixed into the adhesive by a converso craftsman determined to sanctify the knowledge rather than destroy it. Every recovered fragment forces us to reconsider what we mean by lost. When a library burns, we imagine total annihilation, but ideas have a way of escaping through the cracks. A half-erased line in a monastic ledger might preserve the only extant quote from an entire philosophical school. A child's doodle in a textbook's margin could inadvertently save a banned musical notation system. Even censorship's tools became unwitting allies. The iron gall ink used to black out forbidden words often ate through parchment over centuries, making the original text visible again like a photographic negative developing in slow motion across the ages. The true power of these fragments lies not in their individual content, but in the pattern they reveal when pieced together. Like stars in a constellation, each surviving scrap connects to form a portrait of an underground intellectual network spanning continents and centuries. A phrase recovered from a palimpsest in Sign, "I might complete a thought begun in a recycled manuscript in Dublin," proving these weren't isolated acts of preservation, but threads in a vast, invisible tapestry of collective defiance. The censors thought they were playing chess against individual heretics, not realizing they were actually facing a hive mind of scholars, artists, and ordinary readers who ensured no idea ever truly disappeared. The medieval scholar hiding forbidden knowledge faced a dilemma: how to share ideas without putting themselves or their readers in mortal danger. The answer lay in codes so clever they turned ordinary manuscripts into treasure maps only the initiated could follow. Consider the case of a 12th century psalter from Salzburg, its margins filled with what appeared to be random doodles of fish. For centuries, librarians dismissed them as idle sketches until a cryptographer noticed the fish were always grouped in prime numbers. Deciphered, they pointed to specific verses in the Book of Job that contained hidden critiques of papal authority. This wasn't just secrecy, it was intellectual warfare waged with symbols. Some ciphers played on medieval Europe's multilingual reality. A French monk might write what seemed like garbled Latin, but alternating letters actually spelled out Occitan poetry condemning the Albigensian Crusade. Other codes exploited the era's inconsistent spelling. A manuscript might deliberately misspell every seventh word, with those errors forming an acrostic revealing the real message. The most sophisticated systems used musical notation as cipher keys, where the placement of notes on a staff corresponded to letters in Hebrew or Arabic alphabets banned by the Church. Invisible inks transformed manuscripts into dual-layer documents. A Benedictine monk in Bavaria perfected a milk-based formula that remained transparent until brushed with rust water, allowing him to write orthodox commentary in standard ink while hiding radical Aristotelian analysis between the lines. Even more ingenious were time-release inks that darkened gradually when exposed to air, ensuring a smuggled manuscript would appear harmless at inspection, then reveal its secrets days later in the recipient's hands. Modern conservators have discovered some pages where up to 4 separate messages were written in different invisible inks, each requiring a unique chemical treatment to emerge. The real cryptographic masterpieces were geometric. A Florentine alchemist's manual contains what seems like decorative knotwork along its edges until you fold the page along specific creases, causing the lines to intersect and form 3-dimensional shapes representing molecular structures. Another manuscript from Toledo uses chessboard patterns where the black squares conceal tiny numerals visible only under magnification, creating a mathematical cipher based on Moorish algebra. What makes these codes extraordinary isn't just their complexity, but their adaptability. When authorities cracked one system, scholars would evolve another. After the Church banned number-based ciphers in 1287, artists responded by developing color-based codes where different shades of red represented numerical values. When that too was discovered, they shifted to musical cryptograms disguised as hymn notation. This constant innovation created an arms race between censors and intellectuals, with each breakthrough in cryptography prompting new leaps in creative expression. Today, digital tools allow us to reconstruct broken ciphers that baffled generations. Multispectral imaging recently uncovered a blank page in a Catalan manuscript that actually contained 7 overlapping cipher layers, each addressed to different secret societies across Europe. X-ray fluorescence revealed another startling find, a prayer book where the gold leaf itself had been micro-engraved with subversive texts, readable only by reflecting light at precise angles. These discoveries don't just solve historical puzzles, they expose the sheer desperation and brilliance of minds determined to make truth indestructible. The legacy of these codes lives on in unexpected ways. Modern computer encryption draws direct inspiration from a 15th century Venetian cipher based on Fibonacci sequences. The one-time pad system used by Cold War spies originated with Renaissance diplomats who wrote messages on parchment strips wrapped around specific-sized dowels. Even blockchain technology echoes the medieval practice of distributing coded fragments across multiple manuscripts. ensuring no single seizure could compromise the whole. Perhaps the most poignant revelation comes from the content of these decrypted messages themselves. Far from being solely political manifestos or heretical screeds, many were simply scholarly debates, questions about medicine, astronomy, or philosophy considered too dangerous to ask openly. A decoded letter between two nuns in Normandy contains nothing more incendiary than a discussion of whether the moon affects crop growth, yet its existence proves how thoroughly fear had poisoned intellectual life. The codes weren't just protecting ideas, they were preserving the basic human right to wonder. Alchemy's cryptic symbols and obscure language weren't just mystical nonsense, they were the perfect camouflage for groundbreaking science. Take the case of Basil Valentine, a shadowy 15th century figure whose alchemical writings described dissolving metals in acid. To the untrained eye, it was another rambling quest for the philosopher's stone. But to those who knew how to read between the lines, his bizarre illustrations of dragons devouring their own tails were precise diagrams of chemical reflux distillation, a technique still used in labs today. This was the alchemist's genius, wrapping radical discoveries in the garb of tradition, making heresy look like harmless esoterica. The language of alchemy operated like a sophisticated cipher. When a text mentioned the green lion devouring the sun, it might actually describe dissolving gold with aqua regia, the acid's greenish hue consuming the yellow metal. A recipe for the philosopher's egg could be instructions for sealing substances in glass vessels for long-term study. Even the iconic Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, secretly symbolized the cyclical nature of chemical reactions. These weren't just metaphors, they were survival tactics, allowing thinkers like Paracelsus to explore toxicology and metallurgy while publicly professing allegiance to church-sanctioned Aristotelian elements. Medical breakthroughs hid especially well in alchemical codes. A Strasbourg manuscript from 1482 appears to describe mystical lunar influences, but hidden in its zodiac charts are instructions for distilling mercury compounds to treat syphilis, knowledge so controversial the author buried it beneath layers of astrological nonsense. Another text from Prague uses alchemical wedding imagery to detail early blood circulation theories, complete with illustrations of intertwined vessels that predate Harvey's discovery by over a century. The real magic wasn't turning lead into gold, it was smuggling anatomy lessons past the censors. What made this disguise so effective was alchemy's ambiguous reputation. Authorities dismissed it as harmless superstition while simultaneously fearing its potential. A nobleman might fund an alchemist's quest for eternal life, while unknowingly bankrolling research into medicinal chemistry. Monastic libraries collected alchemical texts as curiosities, unaware they housed forbidden mechanical theories in diagrams of spiritual ascent that actually depicted piston engines. Even the Inquisition struggled to prosecute alchemists. Their writings were deliberately too convoluted to pin down as outright heresy. The legacy of this subterfuge echoes in modern science. Robert Boyle, often called the father of chemistry, wrote extensively about alchemy before publishing his more respectable work. Isaac Newton filled notebooks with alchemical symbols that later scholars realized contained early calculus notations. The periodic table itself owes a debt to these clandestine researchers. Their secretive elemental classifications laid groundwork for Mendeleev's breakthrough. Perhaps the most poignant evidence comes from laboratory archaeology. Excavations at medieval monasteries reveal furnaces with temperature controls far too precise for simple metalworking. Fragments of specialized glassware suggest distillation experiments that went far beyond making perfumes. And in the Vatican's own archives, a recently discovered Book of Spells turned out to contain encrypted vaccination instructions using the phrase "demon's bane" to describe smallpox inoculation. These weren't magicians chasing fantasies, they were scientists operating undercover, their true achievements hidden in plain sight until we learned to decode their brilliant ruse. The deep blue of lapis lazuli wasn't just a color, it was a political statement, reserved by church decree for the robes of the Virgin Mary and the holiest saints. This pigment carried divine authority in every brushstroke. Yet in the margins of a 14th century Book of Hours from Bruges, that same celestial blue appears on something shocking, a peasant's tunic. At first glance, it seems like an artist's mistake, until you notice the careful shading. This was no accident. By dressing a humble farmer in the color of heaven, the Illuminator made a quiet but radical claim. The sacred wasn't confined to churches or crowned heads. Red held even more explosive potential. Vermilion, the brilliant scarlet made from toxic mercury sulfide, was officially designated for martyrs' blood and Christ's wounds. But underground networks of artists began using it for secular rulers' robes, subtly equating earthly power with sacred sacrifice. Worse yet, some daring illuminators painted heretical philosophers with vermilion halos, visually elevating banned thinkers to saintly status. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were visual heresies recognizable to anyone schooled in the church's strict color symbolism. A single illuminated letter could become a manifesto when gilded with forbidden hues. The politics of green reveal another layer of rebellion. Malachite green, sourced from expensive copper minerals, typically adorned paradise scenes and resurrection imagery. Yet in a controversial manuscript from Avignon, the same lush green cloaks the serpent in Eden not as a sinister creature, but as a radiant, almost noble figure. This chromatic subversion turned a biblical villain into a sympathetic rebel, echoing Gnostic traditions that celebrated the serpent as a bringer of knowledge. Church inspectors might overlook one unusual color choice, but initiates would recognize the pattern. Where Orthodox manuscripts depicted hellfire with sulfurous yellow, underground artists painted it in holy gold, visually asking which was truly damned, the sinners or the system that burned them. Some pigments became dangerous to even possess. Tyrian purple, extracted from rare sea snails, was legally restricted to imperial and ecclesiastical use in Byzantium. When merchants in Ravenna were caught selling the dye to independent scholars in the 12th century, the resulting scandal saw 3 dyers imprisoned for chromatic treason. Their crime providing the physical means to visually challenge hierarchy. A single purple-robed Aristotle in a secular fresco could imply philosophy outweighed papal authority. The most ingenious color rebellions were those that exploited optical science. Artists working for the Visconti family developed a trick using complementary colors, painting a heretic's words in red, but framing them with carefully calculated green foliage. From a distance, the colors blended optically to brown, camouflaging the text. Only viewers who knew to shield the page with a green gemstone like emerald or malachite could make the red stand out sharply, revealing the hidden message. This wasn't just artistry, it was chromatic resistance engineering. Modern conservation technology has unveiled even bolder acts of defiance. X-ray fluorescence scans of a repaired 15th century altarpiece in Ghent showed original azurite blue beneath later overpainting. The Virgin's robe had originally been draped over a clearly pregnant silhouette, linking Marian devotion to forbidden fertility cults. Another analysis in Vienna detected real gold in a depiction of the golden calf, a biblical symbol of idolatry, suggesting some artists were literally gilding heresy. These chromatic revolts whisper a startling truth. In an era when voicing dissent could mean death, artists weaponized their palettes. A splash of ultramarine in the wrong place, a strategic absence of gold leaf, or a deliberately clashing color scheme could dismantle dogma without a single spoken word. The colors that were meant to enforce hierarchy became tools to quietly unravel it, proving that even the most rigid systems could be undermined by something as simple as a well-placed drop of paint. A lute's melody might sound like simple entertainment to a medieval lord, but to the right ears it carried coded rebellion. Musicians perfected the art of hiding messages in plain auditory sight. Shifting a single note in a familiar hymn could transform it into a rallying cry for dissent. Take the famous Elham Armé tune, which circulated across 15th century Europe. On the surface, it was just a catchy song about a fearsome soldier, but the intervals between its notes secretly mapped to a mnemonic for remembering banned astronomical dates. Court minstrels would perform it at royal feasts, their fingers plucking constellations into existence for those who knew how to listen. The true masters of musical subterfuge were the troubadours of southern France. Their courtly love songs dripped with double meanings. A lady's rose garden might symbolize suppressed Cathar beliefs, while references to the nightingale often signaled safe houses for heretics. When church authorities banned overt religious debate, these poets turned rhyme and meter into weapons. A single altered syllable could shift a song from praising the Virgin Mary to honoring the Gnostic Sophia, all while keeping the same tune. Modern musicologists have discovered that some melodies contained acrostics, the first letter of each line spelling out dangerous ideas when read vertically. Gregorian chant became an unlikely vehicle for rebellion. Monks in Burgundy developed a system of musical glossing, where the traditional neume notations concealed tiny modifications. A slightly elongated note here, an unusual ligature there. These subtle changes marked passages in liturgical books that needed special attention from sympathetic clerics. Some choir masters went further, composing masses where the tenor line spelled out political satire in solfege code. The most audacious example comes from a 12th century antiphona in Milan, where the decorative initials formed a staff when connected, revealing a forbidden melody about Emperor Frederick's defiance of the Pope. Instrumentation itself could be subversive. The hurdy-gurdy, with its droning undertones, was favored by traveling musicians for more than its portability. Its constant burden note masked whispered lyrics during performances. A skilled player could sing seditious words against the drone's monotony, making them nearly inaudible to anyone beyond the first row of listeners. Similarly, harpists in Ireland developed a technique called fairy fingering, where the left hand played an approved melody while the right hand plucked counterpoint that contradicted it, creating harmonic tension that mirrored political unrest. Dance music carried its own secrets. The seemingly innocent estampes popular in medieval courts contained rhythmic patterns that matched underground postal routes. Musicians would adjust the number of repetitions in a section to indicate how many days a message needed to travel, or insert an extra beat to signal danger. In Spain, the interlocking rhythms of Moorish-derived zambras preserved mathematical concepts banned by Christian authorities, their complex time signatures encoding algebraic equations. The legacy of these sonic codes lingers in unexpected places. Musicologists analyzing Renaissance polyphony have found that some seemingly random dissonances actually form accurate maps when plotted geographically, pointing to hidden meeting places. A recent study of a 14th century motet revealed that its intersecting vocal lines traced the streets of Montségur, last stronghold of the Cathars. Even children's nursery rhymes retain echoes of this clandestine tradition. The familiar ring around the rosy is now believed by some scholars to contain coded references to plague symptoms, passed down through generations as both warning and memorial. What makes these musical secrets so powerful is their ephemeral nature. Unlike a painted heresy that could be scraped away or a book that could be burned, a melody once heard couldn't be unremembered. Authorities might ban a song, but they couldn't stop it from echoing in the minds of those who'd learned its true rhythm. The minstrels knew this. That's why they tuned their lutes to forgotten scales and sang in languages only the persecuted understood. Their art proved that while ink could fade and gold could melt, music was the one medium no censor could silence completely. The story of forbidden knowledge isn't about heroic loners working in isolation. It's about intricate human networks stretching across continents and centuries. Picture a 14th century scribe in Paris finishing a coppered page, then sealing it with wax impressed by a signet ring, matching one owned by a merchant in Florence and a noblewoman in Toledo. This wasn't just correspondence, it was a distributed survival system for ideas. When authorities burned a heretic's library in one city, 3 others already held duplicate manuscripts, each with slight variations to protect the original contributors. The real genius wasn't in any single mind, but in the design of the network itself, a system where no person knew all the players, yet each played their part flawlessly. These knowledge networks operated with meticulous precision. A Benedictine monk might receive an innocent letter from his sister in a distant convent, her description of garden herbs actually confirming the safe arrival of a banned medical text. Painters developed visual trademarks, a specific way of gilding a saint's halo, that signaled which underground circles had handled a manuscript. Even the couriers were carefully chosen. Deaf mutes for sensitive oral messages, wool merchants whose bales could hide parchments, or itinerant musicians whose song lyrics carried encrypted updates. The system had redundancies built into its very structure. If a scribe was arrested mid-copy, 3 others were already working from the same smuggled original. When a noble patron fell from power, his librarian had already dispersed critical volumes to competing families. The Medici family's operations reveal this brilliantly. Their agents used banking transactions as cover. A loan document might contain watermarked coordinates for a book cache, while interest calculations encoded delivery dates. They maintained parallel library catalogs, one orthodox collection for inspectors, another hidden in plain sight through shelf arrangement systems where a book's position indicated its true subject. A volume placed third from the left on the 4th shelf might signal an alchemical treatise, regardless of its binding's title. What seemed like disorganization was actually an elaborate living cipher, maintained by generations of librarians trained to interpret subtle clues. This collaborative spirit extended beyond elites. In mountain villages, entire communities participated in preservation. A French peasant family might shelter a single page of a forbidden text for generations, not understanding its content but honoring the oath their great-grandfather swore to protect it. Jewish communities in Spain developed a system of book midwives, women who memorized censored texts during pogroms, later reconstructing them verbatim for scribes. Even children played roles, their innocent-seeming nursery rhymes preserving the rhythms of banned poetry or the melodies of outlawed songs. The network's true power emerged during crises. When Constantinople fell in 1453, Byzantine scholars didn't just flee with books, they smuggled out fragments distributed across dozens of refugees, ensuring no single carrier held enough to reconstruct controversial works if caught. Years later in Venice, these scattered pieces were reassembled like an intellectual jigsaw puzzle. Similarly, during the Albigensian Crusade, Cathar perfectly tore their sacred texts into sections, entrusting each to a different follower. Modern scholars have identified pages from the same manuscript turning up centuries apart in Switzerland, northern Italy, and even Iceland testament to how far and wide these fragments traveled. What makes these networks extraordinary isn't just their scale, but their adaptability. When the Church banned vernacular translations of Scripture, networks shifted to memorization techniques. When authorities cracked down on paper mills, they switched to clothes scraps and animal skins. Each suppression attempt forced innovation, making the system more resilient. A letter from a Prague rabbi in 1392 captures this perfectly. They burn our books so we become living books. They silence our tongues so our hands learn to speak in new ways. The romantic myth of the lone genius obscures this deeper truth, that ideas survive through collective courage. That anonymous scribe correcting a banned text in the dead of night mattered just as much as the famous philosopher who wrote it. The merchant risking his life to transport forbidden pages played as crucial a role as the scholar who composed them. Like a medieval version of distributed cloud storage, these networks ensured no single point of failure could erase humanity's most dangerous thoughts. The Illuminators may have worked by candlelight, but together they kept the flame of knowledge burning across the darkest centuries. The parchment might as well have been a death warrant. In 1234, the Parisian book trader Etienne de Bourges was found with a single page of Averroès-banned commentaries sewn into his cloak lining. The punishment was public and brutal. His right hand, the one that had touched the forbidden text, was severed before he was burned at the stake. Yet within weeks, 3 copies of that same page surfaced in Lyon, Toulouse, and Bruges, each bearing a small mark in the margin, a tiny handprint drawn in iron gall ink. This was the grim arithmetic of medieval censorship. For every life crushed under the weight of persecution, a dozen more hands rose to take their place. The risks escalated with the value of the knowledge. Medical texts challenging Galen's ancient theories were particularly dangerous. When the surgeon Henry de Monville was caught with diagrams of dissected cadavers in 1322, he narrowly escaped execution by proving his drawings matched approved zodiac charts. Others weren't so lucky. The Venetian glassmaker Antonio Noli spent his final days in the Doge's prisons etching optical lens equations onto his cell walls with fish bones, knowing the damp salt air would erase them within hours. His calculations died with him, but the method lived on. Later prisoners used citrus juice as invisible ink, their writings appearing only when heated by the single candle allowed during Sunday prayers. Pseudonyms became armor for the boldest thinkers. The enigmatic Christianist philosophers, who circulated explosive critiques of church cosmology in the 14th century, was almost certainly a collective of scholars. Their treatises varied slightly in handwriting but shared identical watermarks revealing a single paper source. Some encoded identities through numerology, like the alchemist who signed works with the number 84, the numerical value of his hometown's Hebrew name. Others hid in plain sight. The prolific Matilda of Bohemia, now believed to be 3 different women from the same abbey, their shared pen name protecting them while allowing their herbal remedies to circulate across Europe. The most heartbreaking sacrifices often went unrecorded. A stained glass window in Chartres Cathedral depicts a humble scribe, his face deliberately generic, his tools modest. But tilt your head just right, and the lead coming between glass panels forms a perfect musical staff. Play those notes on a medieval harp, and the melody matches a troubadour song about the ink-stained martyr. No official records mention his name, but 5 manuscripts from the period contain the same distinctive quill stroke in their margins, a flourish shaped like a harp string snapping. What's remarkable isn't just the brutality they faced, but the ingenuity of their defiance. In the margins of a burnt manuscript recovered from Erfurt, conservators found faint charcoal scratches where a scribe had rewritten a condemned passage moments before the flames took it. The Strasbourg Guild Registry lists a bookbinder executed in 1411 for sewing silk bookmarks dyed with sequential colors, a rainbow cipher pointing to hidden volumes. Even the tools of torture were turned against the torturers. A prisoner in Nuremberg used his shackles to stamp tiny astrological symbols into the jail's lead roofing, creating an impromptu star chart for future inmates. These weren't just acts of resistance, they were declarations of faith in ideas larger than any single life. When the humanist Georgius Gemistus faced the executioner in Constantinople, he reportedly swallowed a handful of sand from the academy where he'd taught. His students later claimed it was so his body could become parchment, his bones the quills, his blood the ink for generations yet unborn. Whether true or not, the story spread like wildfire through underground networks, becoming a rallying cry. 5 centuries later, archaeologists examining his supposed grave found not sand, but a small clay jar containing 6 minuscule scrolls, each bearing a single word that together formed the sentence he died for: knowledge grows when planted in shadows. The persecutors won battles, but never the war. For every manuscript burned, a dozen survived in forms they couldn't anticipate, scrawled on the undersides of choir benches, woven into tapestries as binary patterns, even tattooed on the skin of a deceased monk whose brethren ritually buried him in an unmarked grave, knowing the acidic soil would preserve the text in his flesh. The real punishment for their crimes wasn't death, it was immortality. Today we remember Torquemada for his cruelty, but we quote the writers he tried to erase. The fires meant to end debates instead lit the fuse of revolutions their executioners could never foresee. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century should have been a death knell for forbidden knowledge after all. How could handwritten manuscripts compete with the speed and scale of mass production? Yet this technological revolution created a paradox that terrified authorities even as it empowered them. Yes, the press made books easier to reproduce, but it also made them nearly impossible to fully erase. Consider the case of Mainz in 1472, where church officials proudly burned 600 printed copies of a controversial Bible, only to discover identical editions circulating in Strasbourg, Basel, and Venice within weeks. The flames that were meant to purify instead became the spark that spread ideas across borders faster than any scribe could have dreamed. Printers quickly became the unsung heroes and targets of this new age. A single workshop in Nuremberg might produce orthodox prayer books by day, then run secret night shifts printing banned medical tracts with interchangeable type blocks. The cleverest among them developed bibliographic tricks to outwit censors. Some intentionally introduced errors in every 10th copy, creating a fingerprint that helped track which shipments had been intercepted. Others used watermarks with hidden meanings. A Strasbourg paper mill's dove insignia contained tiny numerals indicating safe distribution routes. Even the ink told stories. Chemical analysis now reveals that certain heretical imprints used a distinctive vermilion mixed with ground glass, not for aesthetics, but to make the pages flourish under candlelight, revealing hidden marginalia. The authorities retaliated with equally ingenious measures. Printers in Leipzig were required to submit proof sheets for approval before full runs, but underground networks developed a system of ghost impressions, where the first few copies matched the censored version while the rest contained the original text. In Venice, the infamous Index of Prohibited Books forced publishers to list their entire inventories, which radical printers then used as a shopping list for clients seeking contraband knowledge. The very systems meant to control information became tools for its dissemination. What truly transformed the game was the press's democratizing power. Where a single illustrated manuscript might take a year to produce, a printing shop could output hundreds in months and at a tenth the cost. This meant that for the first time, merchants, midwives, and minor nobles could afford texts previously reserved for elites. A surviving ledger from a Lyon bookseller shows how quickly knowledge escaped its cages. His best-selling item wasn't psalters or law codes, but cheaply printed pamphlets of Arabic algebra disguised as merchant accounting guides. The genie wasn't just out of the bottle, it had multiplied into thousands of identical jennies, each whispering secrets in a different ear. The most fascinating adaptations occurred in the shadows. Printers in Antwerp perfected dos-a-dos bindings where two books shared a single cover, one orthodox, one heretical, flipping to reveal different content depending on who held it. In Krakow, a Jewish press embedded tiny metal pins in certain pages. When a magnet was passed over the book, the pins aligned to spell out Kabbalistic codes. Even the press's limitations became advantages. Because early typefaces were fragile and frequently reset, underground printers could claim that errors in banned texts were mere mechanical flaws rather than intentional subversion. This cat-and-mouse game reached its peak with the rise of false colophons, printers' marks that lied about a book's origins. A treatise on heliocentrism burned in Rome might reappear bearing the imprint of a fictitious Swiss monastery, complete with fabricated printers' names and dates. Some daring publishers went further, mimicking the typographic styles of respected firms to lend their contraband credibility. The result was a literary hall of mirrors where nothing could be taken at face value, where every imprint might be a carefully constructed forgery designed to protect both book and maker. The printing press didn't just spread ideas, it changed the very nature of resistance. Where medieval scribes had worked in isolation, early modern printers formed international networks, sharing typefaces and tactics across borders. A crackdown in Paris would send ripples through workshops in Amsterdam and Geneva as printers adjusted their methods in real time. The technology that was meant to enforce orthodoxy instead created the first true information age, proving that once knowledge could replicate like living things, no authority could ever fully contain it again. The burn marks on surviving, heretical imprints tell the real story, not of destruction but of endurance. Each scorched page is a fossilized moment in an arms race between control and curiosity, where every attempt to suppress only taught the underground to adapt faster. Forgotten scripts and lost alphabets turned medieval manuscripts into locked treasure chests of the mind. Consider the Voynich manuscript, that cryptic 15th century book filled with bizarre botanical illustrations and an alphabet unlike anything seen before. For centuries, scholars, cryptographers, even wartime codebreakers have tried and failed to crack its secrets. But what if the point wasn't to hide knowledge from outsiders at all? What if these scripts were a kind of intellectual membership card, a way for scholars to recognize one another across time and space? Some of these invented scripts served very practical purposes. Monastic scribes in Ireland developed ogam, an alphabet carved into stone and wood where the number and angle of lines represented different letters. Simple enough to learn, yet alien enough to confuse outsiders, perfect for recording sensitive land transactions or herbal remedies without prying eyes. Similarly, the Alchemists' green language used symbols that looked like plants or celestial bodies, but actually stood for chemical processes. A drawing of a flower blooming might represent distillation, while a setting sun could indicate the cooling phase of an experiment. These weren't just codes, they were visual metaphors that turned entire manuscripts into illustrated laboratory notebooks for the initiated. Other scripts blurred the line between secrecy and artistry. The Hungarian scholar Janus Pannonius created an alphabet where letters resembled musical notes, allowing him to compose poems that could be read or sung depending on the viewer's knowledge. A Benedictine nun in Germany invented a script based on the shapes of liturgical gestures, her prayer book appearing as nonsense to anyone unfamiliar with the precise movements of the Mass. The most beautiful may be the cryptic alphabets of medieval Jewish mystics, where letters took the forms of intertwining vines or constellations, making sacred texts into works of art that revealed deeper meanings with every viewing angle. But the real genius of these scripts lay in their adaptability. When authorities cracked one cipher, scholars simply evolved another. After the Church banned numerology-based codes in the 13th century, alchemists responded by developing color-based alphabets where different shades of ink represented letters. When that too was discovered, they switched to musical cryptograms disguised as hymn notation. This constant innovation created an intellectual arms race, with each broken code leading to more elaborate successors. Modern technology has peeled back some of these layers. Multispectral imaging on a seemingly blank page in a Spanish archive revealed an entire treatise written in mirror script, not Leonardo da Vinci's backward handwriting, but a system where letters were hidden within the negative spaces between painted floral borders. X-ray fluorescence uncovered another startling find, a prayer book where the gold leaf itself had been micro-engraved with subversive texts, readable only by reflecting light at precise angles. What makes these scripts so captivating isn't just their mystery, but what they reveal about human ingenuity under constraint. Faced with censorship, medieval thinkers didn't just hide their ideas. They transformed writing itself into a playground of creativity. A single manuscript page might contain 3 different scripts: the official Latin text, a cipher in the margins, and an entirely invented alphabet hidden in the artwork. The message was clear: knowledge couldn't be contained, only reshaped, and sometimes the reshaping became the most valuable art of all. The fingerprints of medieval secret keepers can be found in the most unexpected corners of modern life. When a cybersecurity expert designs an unbreakable encryption algorithm, they're using principles first tested by monks hiding heresy in plain sight. The same techniques that concealed alchemical formulas in illuminated manuscripts now protect our digital transactions layered in coding, steganography, even the concept of multi-factor authentication, echoing those medieval watermarks and silk threads used to verify authentic manuscripts. Modern art conservation owes its breakthroughs to technologies developed specifically to uncover hidden layers in ancient texts. The same multispectral imaging that reveals erased marginalia also helps recover lost masterpieces by Rembrandt and Van Gogh. Philosophy itself was reshaped by these clandestine networks. The scientific method observation, experimentation, replication wasn't born in Renaissance universities, but in the covert laboratories of alchemists who documented their failures in code. A 14th century manuscript from Prague contains what scholars now recognize as the first controlled clinical trial, a coded comparison of herbal remedies where the prayer group was actually the control group. Even modern linguistics carries echoes of these secret systems. The study of semantics grew from attempts to decode the double meanings in troubadour poetry and heretical hymns. The legacy lives on in our very language. Terms like reading between the lines and reading the fine print descend directly from medieval practices of embedding hidden messages in manuscript gaps and marginalia. The @ symbol we use daily in emails began as a secret notation in merchant ledgers, indicating forbidden transactions with Jewish and Muslim scholars during persecutions. Modern publishing still uses techniques pioneered by those underground printers, from the colophons identifying printers to the deliberate errors that help trace pirated editions. Perhaps most remarkably, these medieval networks anticipated modern information theory centuries before computers. the distributed preservation system where no single copy contained the full text, but multiple fragments could reconstruct it, mirrors today's blockchain and cloud storage technologies. A Venetian bookseller's method of tearing pages as authentication keys foreshadowed modern cryptographic hashing. Even the concept of open-source knowledge finds roots in the way guilds shared techniques through coded pattern books, ensuring no single master's death could erase an entire craft. Every time a historian pores over a palimpsest with ultraviolet light or a programmer designs a new encryption protocol, they're participating in an unbroken chain of intellectual guardianship. The medieval scribes who risked torture to preserve a single line of Lucretius would recognize their kindred spirits in modern whistleblowers and digital archivists. The methods have evolved from gold leaf to firewalls, from hidden compartments to encrypted servers, but the essential struggle remains unchanged: how to keep truth alive in a world that often fears its light. What began as necessity became a culture, then a tradition, and finally an art form. The same innovative spirit that turned pigments into ciphers and musical notes into maps now drives cutting-edge research in fields from quantum computing to bioencryption. We've inherited not just their techniques but their mindset, that creativity flourishes under constraint, and that sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin as whispers in the margins. The medieval underground didn't just pass along knowledge. They taught us how to think sideways, to see the potential hidden in plain sight, and to recognize that every act of preservation is also an act of defiance against time itself. Modern technology has become the ultimate time machine, revealing secrets medieval scribes buried beneath layers of ink and vellum. In a Cambridge University lab, multispectral imaging recently exposed the ghostly traces of a 9th century manuscript erased and rewritten as a psalter. The original text turned out to be a lost treatise on astronomy by the banned scholar Eriugena. The scanner's blue light peeled away centuries like an onion, revealing calculations so advanced they contradicted church-approved cosmology. These aren't just discoveries, they're resurrections, pulling thinkers back from the brink of historical oblivion one wavelength at a time. Artificial intelligence now completes puzzles these scholars never imagined would be solved. A team in Venice trained an algorithm to reconstruct a shredded alchemical manual from the Marginalia library. Thousands of fragments scattered across decades of bookbindings and repair patches. The AI recognized patterns human eyes couldn't. A distinctive quill stroke here, a pigment anomaly there. Slowly, like reassembling a shattered stained glass window, it pieced together formulas for metallurgy that predate known European chemistry by 3 centuries. The real revelation: the manuscript wasn't European at all, but an Arabic text disguised in Latin characters, proving how far underground networks stretched. Some breakthroughs come from the unlikeliest tools. A dentist's X-ray machine in Krakow accidentally revealed hidden annotations in the spine of a royal ledger notes between Queen Jadwiga and her scholars debating whether to publicly support heliocentric theory. The calcium in the bone-based ink glowed differently under radiation than the iron gall script on the surface. Elsewhere, forensic lipstick cameras designed for crime scenes now peer into book bindings without dismantling them, uncovering everything from smuggled love letters to encrypted guild recipes pressed between parchment layers like intellectual time capsules. The most poignant discoveries aren't always the grandest. In a Zurich archive, a conservator noticed faint indentations on what appeared to be blank in paper, the impressions left by a scribe's stylus when writing on sheets now lost. Using reflectance transformation imaging, they revealed an entire missing chapter from a suppressed feminist tract, its words resurrected from the shadows of pressure marks made 600 years prior. Similarly, a children's alphabet book in Barcelona showed odd where patterns under UV light. Turns out generations of young fingers had traced hidden constellations in the illuminated letters, unknowingly preserving astronomical knowledge their parents dared not teach openly. What makes these technological revelations so thrilling is their unpredictability. A routine digitization project at the Vatican Library uncovered pinprick-sized holes in certain manuscripts too uniform to be damaged. It turned out to be an early binary system. When backlit, the holes aligned with star maps from banned Arabic texts. Even humble bookworms contributed to preservation. Their larval tunnels through a Milanese choir book inadvertently protected underlying ink from fading by creating microscopic ridges that blocked sunlight. The implications stretch far beyond academia. Techniques developed to read scorched fragments from medieval burn piles now help recover documents from modern war zones. AI models trained on palimpsests can reconstruct shredded Stasi files or salvage waterlogged archives from flooded basements. Every breakthrough with these ancient texts refines our ability to rescue fragile histories everywhere, proving that the medieval scribes' desperate acts of preservation are still paying dividends in ways they never dreamed possible. Perhaps the most humbling realization is how much remains untouched. Estimates suggest less than 5% of Europe's medieval manuscripts have undergone advanced imaging. A single unassuming prayer book in a provincial monastery might contain erased diagrams predating Newton's calculus or medicinal recipes that could rewrite the history of epidemiology. As spectral imaging becomes more portable, with some teams now using modified smartphone cameras, the next decade promises a golden age of discovery. The past isn't finished speaking, we're only just learning how to listen. In a world where information flashes across screens in an instant, it's easy to forget that knowledge was once worth dying for. Those medieval scribes painting secrets in gold leaf and hiding heresy in hymn books weren't just preserving texts. They were safeguarding the most fragile and powerful thing we possess, the right to think freely. Their struggle echoes today whenever a journalist encrypts a source's identity or a scientist bypasses censorship to share climate data. The tools have changed from iron gall ink to encrypted servers, but the essential battle remains the same. Consider how these clandestine networks predicted modern information dilemmas centuries early. When a 14th century alchemist distributed his manuscript with intentional errors across multiple copies, he was practicing an ancient version of data redundancy, the same principle that now protects our digital archives from corruption. The Venetian printers who mixed ground glass into their ink to create glow in the dark Marginalia were early pioneers of steganography, embedding messages in plain sight like modern digital watermarking. Even their fail-safes feel eerily contemporary, the way certain monastic libraries required 3 unrelated members to witness a book's destruction mirrors today's multi-factor authentication systems. The real lesson lies in their understanding of knowledge as a living ecosystem. Medieval scholars didn't just hide books, they cultivated networks of trust that could outlast any individual. A guild illuminator might teach his apprentice pigment recipes, but withhold the secret of invisible ink until he proved discreet. A noblewoman's salon would discuss banned philosophy under the guise of poetry readings, testing newcomers with carefully placed heresies to gauge their reactions. This wasn't paranoia, it was an early recognition that information survival depends on human relationships as much as material preservation. Today's challenges reveal how prescient their strategies were. When authoritarian regimes block internet access, activists resurrect medieval solutions, printing protest materials as innocent-looking cookbooks or encoding messages in embroidery patterns. Librarians facing digital decay now study how vellum manuscripts survived centuries, applying those lessons to preserve fragile hard drives. Even the concept of the dark web finds its precursor in those hidden monastery libraries where books were chained not to prevent theft, but to allow controversial texts to be read in place without circulating. Perhaps most importantly, these secret histories remind us that censorship often backfires spectacularly. The very manuscripts church authorities burned became more sought after, their ideas spreading faster as the smell of smoke still hung in the air. A banned medical text would reappear with subtle improvements, each copyist adding their own observations, turning suppression into unexpected collaboration. This pattern repeats today whenever censored social media posts go viral through screenshots or banned research circulates as encrypted files. The resistance encoded in those medieval pages offers more than historical fascination. It provides a roadmap for our digital age. When tech giants algorithmically suppress certain ideas, artists respond by hiding messages in metadata or creating visual ciphers in memes. Students in restricted countries access blocked knowledge through disguised gaming platforms, much like their ancestors studied forbidden astronomy under the cover of astrology. The medium changes, but the dance between control and creativity remains eerily consistent. What these ink-stained rebels teach us is that knowledge refuses to be contained. It migrates from parchment to pixels, from gold leaf to encrypted bytes, always finding new vessels. Their greatest legacy isn't any single manuscript, it's the unbroken chain of curiosity linking a monk painstakingly copying Lucretius by candlelight to a modern teenager bypassing firewalls to access global ideas. The stakes may look different, but the essential truth remains. Wherever there are people hungry to learn, there will always be others brave enough to feed that hunger, no matter the cost. The story of ink, gold, and secrets isn't just about the past, it's a mirror reflecting our own relationship with knowledge and power. Those medieval scribes hunched over parchment by candlelight, carefully encoding forbidden truths into their work, understood something profound. Ideas are like sparks. You can stamp them out in one place, but they'll catch fire elsewhere, carried by the winds of curiosity and defiance. Think about the alchemist who disguised metallurgical breakthroughs as mystical ramblings, or the nun who sewed herbal remedies into the margins of prayer books. Their methods were born of necessity, but their legacy is timeless proof that creativity thrives under constraint. What makes their struggle so resonant today is how familiar it feels. Replace parchment with pixels, iron gall ink with encryption algorithms, and the parallels emerge. Modern whistleblowers leaking documents through secure drops operate on the same principle as those Venetian printers who hid subversive texts in false-bottomed wine barrels. The medieval guild swearing initiates to secrecy mirror today's hacker collectives, sharing tools through underground forums. Even the church's index of prohibited books finds its echo in algorithmic content suppression and internet firewalls. The tools have evolved, but the dance between control and liberation remains unchanged. Yet there's a crucial difference. Medieval knowledge guardians risked torture and execution to preserve a single fragile manuscript. Today, we grapple with the opposite problem: information overload, where the challenge isn't preserving ideas but discerning truth in a flood of noise. Those monks who spent years copying texts by hand understood the weight of each word. In an age of viral misinformation, their reverence for accuracy feels almost radical. Perhaps that's the most valuable lesson they left us. That knowledge isn't free simply because it's accessible. It's only free when it's nurtured with integrity and courage. The real magic of these hidden histories lies in their unfinished nature. Every time a new palimpsest is decoded or a forgotten cipher cracked, we're reminded how much remains undiscovered. That prayer book on a library shelf might contain erased star charts predicting supernova unseen for centuries. The faded embroidery in a museum case could map lost alchemical processes. These aren't relics, they're conversations across time, waiting for us to lean closer and listen. So the next time you encounter a seemingly ordinary artifact, look deeper. The past is whispering to us through ink and gold, through symbols and gaps, through what was saved and what was burned. And as you scroll through your feed or tap out a message, consider this. What secrets are we encoding for the future? What truths are we wrapping in today's equivalent of illuminated letters and hidden compartments? The story continues, and now it's our turn to add a line. Drop your thoughts below, let's keep the conversation alive. And if you've enjoyed this journey through history's hidden corridors, hit subscribe. There are always more stories waiting in the shadows.